Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laik Siddiqui, the father of holophase. We begin with a scene so ordinary, you almost miss how impossible it is. You and I are standing in the same room. We both look at the same chair. We both say, "That's a chair," and we agree. That agreement is not a small thing. It is not a social convenience. It is not obvious. It is a miracle of architecture. Because inside our heads, nothing is shared. Our eyes are different, our nerves are different, our histories are different. Even our language arrived in us through different routes. And yet, somehow, we can point to something and say, yes, the same. Episode 14 exists to answer one question, and it is the most foundational question a universe can answer. What must be true about any reality at all so that separate windows of access can converge on one publicly shareable structure? Not how the universe began, not what it is made of, not what happens next. Episode 14 is not a story of becoming. It is the compiler that makes stories legally speakable later. It is the blueprint of the public. And if you stay with me, I'm going to make you feel why this blueprint is not just about our universe. It is about any universe in which anything can be publicly known, debated, tested, and shared. Because public truth is not a mood. It is not a cultural choice. It is not a philosophy. It is a piece of architecture. And architecture has rules. 1. The first humility. We never see reality as a whole. We only see through windows. Imagine you're inside a dark house. You can't step outside. You can't climb onto the roof. The only way you can see the world is through a few small windows. One window faces the street. One faces the garden. One faces the sky. You cannot knock down the walls. You cannot see everything at once. You can only see a slice under conditions. That is not a human weakness. That is the universal condition of any knower inside any universe. Access is finite. Access is local. Access is windowed. Episode 14 takes this humility and turns it into law. All public claims must be made inside finite, licensed windows. A window here is not just poetry. It is a disciplined object. It means a bounded access regime. What you looked at, with what instrument, at what resolution, with what sampling pattern, with what masks, with what limits, with what noise. And this immediately gives us a consequence that is so simple it hurts. If you don't declare the window, you cannot declare the claim. Because without the window, there is no shared reference for what we did, and therefore no shared reference for what we found. This is why so many debates never end. People fight about conclusions while hiding their windows. One person is looking through a microscope, another through a telescope. They argue about what reality really is, while they are literally not using the same kind of access. Episode 14 refuses that confusion. It says, with zero mercy, no window, no claim. Number 2. The second humility. The only public currency is difference, not absolute readings. Now we hit the next impossibility. Even if we both use windows, our raw measurements may not match. Two thermometers can disagree. Two cameras can disagree on color. Two microphones can disagree on loudness. Two clocks can disagree on the time. So what can we share? Episode 14 makes a choice that is severe and liberating. Absolute readings are not public. Only differences are public. Here's the simplest example. Two people each own a watch. One watch is 5 minutes fast. One watch is 2 minutes slow. If they compare the time as a raw number, they argue forever. But if they both measure changes, how much the second hand moves over 1 minute of a shared procedure, now they can agree. The absolute reading is private calibration. The difference is public currency. Episode 14 builds everything on that. And now we introduce the single primitive of the entire language. We name it phi, pronounced phi. Formally, phi maps the event set X to the circle S1. But for audio, I want you to hear it like this. Phi is an assignment of each event to a position on a circle. Not a position in space, not a time on a timeline. A position on a loop, because many comparisons are cyclic. Phase, rotation, periodicity, wraparound. And now comes the public meaning rule. Only delta phi is speakable. Absolute phi is mute. Delta phi means the difference between two phi values. And episode 14 immediately enforces a deep invariance. If your fact changes when we shift phi by a constant, phi goes to phi plus a constant, then your fact was never public. It depended on hidden anchoring. It depended on a private choice. It was not something that could belong to a shared world. This is the beginning of the blueprint. Any universe that allows public knowledge must allow some notion of difference that survives calibration shifts, offsets, and relabelings. Passports. Every claim must carry its birth certificate. Now we face the next problem. Even differences can be meaningless if we don't know the conditions under which they were produced. So episode 14 introduces one of its most practical and most revolutionary disciplines. Every window carries a passport. A passport is not nice documentation. A passport is the birth certificate of a claim. It records what the public needs in order to audit the claim. What instrument class produced the comparisons? How calibration was done? Lineage, standards, drift checks. What was masked out or excluded? What the sampling pattern was? What the boundary was? What the expected uncertainty is? What the legal ceiling of detail is? What tests were applied to prevent cheating? And the rule becomes uncompromising. No passport, no entry into the compiler. Let me make this human. In a courtroom, a witness says, "I saw him." The judge asks, "From where? Under what light? How long? How far? Were you tired? Were you wearing glasses?" That is a passport. Without it, the statement cannot become public judgment. Episode 14 turns science into that same kind of admissibility. Not to be annoying, but because public truth needs a court. 4. Coherence, the price of legibility. Now we hit something everyone knows, but most people ignore when they're excited. Sometimes you record data, but you cannot certify structure. You've seen this with a blurry video. The video exists, yes, but you cannot say, "This proves that is a face." You can only say, "There is a blur." Episode 14 formalizes this with a coherence license. Call it gamma of W, the coherence of window W. Below a threshold, you may log data, but you may not certify structure. This is a brutal but beautiful rule, because it eliminates one of the biggest diseases in modern knowledge, mistaking noise patterns for reality. And it also forces something else into the open: aliasing. You know the old movie illusion where a wagon wheel seems to rotate backward? That's not deep physics. That's sampling lying. Episode 14 treats aliasing as counterfeit structure. If your sampling stencil is illegal, you are not allowed to promote the output as public structure. You excise it, you mask it, you refuse it. Because public does not mean I saw something. Public means we can certify it survives audits, identifiability, and the ceiling. The universe may be deep, but our public sentence is finite. Now we arrive at one of the core pillars of episode 14. Even in a high quality window, there is a limit to what you can legitimately claim. If your data cannot distinguish two possibilities, you don't get to pick one and call it knowledge. Episode 14 calls this the identifiability gate. And then comes the hard ceiling, NMAX, the maximum legal differentiation depth supported by the window. Here's the everyday analogy. Zoom in on a photo. At first, you see the face clearly. Zoom more, you see pores. Zoom more, you see pixel blocks. Zoom more, you see compression artifacts. The world may be perfectly detailed, but your window has a ceiling. Episode 14 says, if you claim derivatives beyond NMAX, your claim is not wrong. Your claim is undefined. That word is sacred. Undefined means you try to say something the window cannot support as a public statement. And this is blueprint level again. Any universe with public knowledge must allow finite certificates, finite, auditable claims that stop at the legal ceiling of access. Otherwise, knowledge becomes endless hallucination. What we actually feed the machine? Comparator graphs, not hidden geometry. Now I'm going to say something that reverses most people's instincts. Episode 14 does not begin with coordinates. It does not begin with a background grid. It does not begin with space as a container. The raw input is simply events plus comparison edges. We call it a comparator graph. Nodes are events of access, edges are delta phi comparisons, each with a passport. No geometry is allowed in the door, because episode 14 is not allowed to smuggle spacetime as a primitive. If geometry becomes public, it must be compiled from comparisons, not assumed as scaffolding. Think of it like this. Imagine you're in darkness with many microphones. A sound happens. Each microphone records a delay and intensity. From differences alone, you can infer a structure like layout. But you did not begin with the map. You derived the map from comparisons. Episode 14 insists on the same honesty. 7. Lifts and cuts. Unwrapping the circle without cheating. Phi is circle valued. Differentiation is easier on a line. So we do a careful move. We locally unwrap the circle into a line using a lift. We call the lifted variable phi tilde. I'll say phi tilde. Now we can differentiate locally. But the lift is bookkeeping, not reality. So episode 14 enforces. Public results must be lift invariant. If changing the lift changes the result is not public structure. Sometimes, global unwrapping fails, like flattening a globe onto a map. Then we introduce a cut. A cut is a seam, like the international dateline. You can move it. Reality should not change. So episode 14 demands cut movability. If your output depends on the cut, it is bookkeeping, not structure. This is how the compiler refuses representation worship. 8. The certified domain D, where derivatives are legal statements. After we apply passports, coherence thresholds, identifiability checks, ceiling NMAX, lift discipline, cut discipline, aliasing excision, what remains is a legal region. Episode 14 calls this the certified domain D. D is not space. It is not the world. It is simply the region where our operators are lawful and therefore our statements can be public. Outside D, Derivatives are illegal statements. And episode 14 treats mystery in a new way, not as romance, as typed operator failure. Undefined is not mystical, it is legal. 9. The first forced public object. A equals d phi tilde. Now something unavoidable appears. Once you have a certified domain and the local lift, you can differentiate. And the first carrier of variation is A equals d phi tilde. Say it like this. A equals the derivative of the lifted phi. A is the minimal public fingerprint of change inside the window. Not particles, not forces, just the certified carrier of variation. If phi is height, A is slope. And now the triunity enforcement arrives as a firewall. From A, we can take 3 readouts. Omega, cadence, time-like readout. Kappa, texture, space-like readout. Nu, drift, motion-like readout. But none of these are primitives. They are projections, like one sculpture casting 3 shadows on 3 walls. The shadows differ. The sculpture is one. Episode 14 forbids worshipping one shadow and calling it reality. Everything must recombine back into A. Then, JETS, the finite alphabet of local public structure. Now we build the finite local alphabet. We take derivatives of A up to the window's legal ceiling and max. This finite stack is called a JET. In plain language, a JET is the finite local fingerprint of how phi varies, as far as the window can legitimately resolve. Episode 14's claim is, all certified local public structure is expressible as a function of a finite JET plus legal topology tokens. This is why episode 14 is a blueprint. It says, public structure is not infinite poetry. It is finite, auditable grammar. 11. Lie detectors. How the compiler catches hallucinated physics. Now we install the honesty system. Episode 14 is not just an extractor. It is a liar detector. It runs consistency audits, integrability and commutation audits, where the domain and smoothness allow it. Boundary interior consistency audits, Stokes type checks. Path and decomposition consistency. Different admissible decompositions must agree. If 2 legal ways of computing the same public token disagree, you do not call it new physics. You classify the failure. Cut bookkeeping error. Aliasing artifact. Domain mistyping. Passport failure. Defect obstruction, or true escape candidate. This is the tone of episode 14. Stop romanticizing inconsistency. Force it to confess. 12. Atlases and overlaps. Global meaning is what survives translation. A single window is never the world. So episode 14 compiles an atlas, many windows stitched together. But stitching is not free. If 2 windows overlap, their overlap must agree up to allowed transformations. Lift differences on overlaps must be integer terms. JETs must transform compatibly. Triple overlaps must close, what the atlas calls co-cycle closure. And here is the deep sentence that makes universes public. Global meaning is what survives translation across overlaps. If a claim is true only inside one patch, but dies on overlap, it is not global structure. It is patch private language. Episode 14 refuses to promote patch private claims to reality. 13. Topology, memory, defects, and integers without substances. Now we reach the part that often makes people feel the floor shift under their feet. Even if local derivatives look ordinary, Loops can store global information. If you walk a loop and accumulate A, you can get a loop memory token. That is holonomy. Say it slowly. Ho, lon, o, mi. Everyday analogy. You walk around the mountain and discover your orientation has changed in a way that cannot be erased by local adjustments. That loop stored memory. Now, sometimes loops cannot be shrunk away without crossing special regions. Then you have obstructions. You have places where lifts or jets cannot extend smoothly. Episode 14 calls these defects. Defects are not things by assumption. They are persistent obstructions that survive all allowed redescriptions. And when you count obstructions, you get integers, charges, winding numbers, linking numbers. This is why quantization keeps appearing in deep physics. Closure plus obstruction on a circle produces countability. Episode 14 does not tell a particle story here. It tells a grammar story. Integers arise because public consistency on a circle forces countable tokens when obstructions exist. That is blueprint level, not universe specific. Derived geometry. Geometry is compiled, not assumed. Now we face a human addiction, geometry smuggling. We assume space as a room. We assume distance as primitive. We assume dimension as given. Episode 14 forbids that. Geometry may appear only if it compiles as an invariant function of jets and topology on certified domains and survives overlap tests. So dimension becomes a derived readout, a rank and stability signature, not a metaphysical room count. This is the deep reversal. We do not begin inside a pre-built space. We compile space-like geometry as a stable public compression of comparison structure. That is exactly why episode 14 can be universal. If you assume a specific geometry at the start, you've already assumed a specific universe. Episode 14 refuses. Stability and entities. Things are certificates, not substances. Now we ask, what is an object in a public universe? Episode 14 answers with stability. An entity is not a substance. An entity is a stable invariant signature with a certified stability radius. In everyday language, a thing is what keeps showing up the same way across different windows, different instruments, and small permissible changes within declared uncertainty. If it's stable, it earns a name. If it's not stable, it remains a pattern, not a public object. This is how objecthood becomes public rather than metaphysical. 16. Completeness and escape. Either it compiles or it falsifies us. Now we reach the courage point. Episode 14 seals itself. If something is publicly distinguishable structure, extractable from licensed phi differentiation, it must compile into this pipeline. Jets, topology, invariance, stability, scale stratification. Or it triggers a refusal, an undefined flag, or an escape candidate. An escape is not something surprising. It is something very specific. Licensed, replicated across windows, invariant under redescription, and still non-encodable after exhaustive collapse attempts. If an escape survives, the framework must extend or be falsified for that domain. This is how episode 14 stays scientific. It builds its own death condition. It refuses to become a religion. 17. The zero-leak boundary. The airlock to episode 15. Now we do the most human, most protective act. We stop. We do not let the foundation tell stories. No dynamics, no time evolution, no probability, no entropy, no meaning. No, and then it becomes. Episode 14, outputs only. Certified structure objects, refusal certificates, audit artifacts. Episode 15 may begin only by consuming these outputs through typed interfaces. No new primitives. This boundary is not a limitation. It is what protects public structure from being corrupted by narrative hunger. 18. The final revelation. Why episode 14 is the blueprint for any universe. Now I can say the core claim in one clean breath. If a universe contains finite knowers who can compare notes, disagree meaningfully, audit each other, replicate, correct errors, and accumulate shared knowledge, then that universe must support a public architecture equivalent to episode 14. Not necessarily with our symbols, but with the same necessities. 1. Windows, finite access. 2. Passports, translatable conditions. 3. Difference-only public meaning, delta phi, not absolute. 4. Invariance under redescription, shift, lift, cut independence. 5. Coherence and identifiability gates, legibility and honesty. 6. Finite ceilings, Nmax, legal depth. 7. Certified domains, where statements are lawful. 8. Forced carriers, A equals d phi tilde. 9. Finite alphabets, jets plus topology tokens. 10. Overlap stitching, atlas closure. 11. Topology memory and defects, holonomy, charges, linking. 12. Derived geometry, compiled, not assumed. 13. Stability-based entityhood, objects as certificates. 14. Escape protocols, growth or falsification. 15. Zero-leak boundary, structure separated from story. If any one of these is missing, you might still have experience inside that universe. You might still have private impressions. You might still have poetry, but you will not have public science. You will not have durable shared truth. You will not have a world where we agree is anything more than a fragile social coincidence. So episode 14 is not merely a theory about our universe. It is the explicit rendering of what must already be true in any universe where public truth can exist. So let me end exactly where we began, with the chair. The chair is not the deepest thing. The deepest thing is that you and I can agree on the chair. And episode 14 is the first time we stop saying, of course, and instead build a machine that makes that agreement lawful. Differences, not absolutes. Windows, not God's eye views. Passports, not trust me claims. Invariants, not stories. Ceilings, not infinite fantasies. Topology, not metaphysical substances. Stability, not assumed objects. Escape, not dogma. And a boundary that keeps the foundation clean. That is episode 14, a silent compiler, the blueprint of the public. And the reason it is universal is simple. Any universe that can be known together must in some form compile this way. Always. Peace be upon you.